at the psychology of power, one thing that I found, regardless of the type or the magnitude of power that we're talking about, one thing that I've found seems to be ever present is a sense of feeling threatened by those over whom that power is being exercised. And this feeling of threat is for everybody. Everybody who has some unearned power or control over the life or the lives of others. It obviously starts with parents. The relationship between a parent and a child represents to me, at least as far as I can think of right now, the greatest power disparity between any two human beings, including slave and master. A slave can run away. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not comparing all parent-child relationship to master-slave relationships as far as the treatment is concerned. We're talking here about the dependence and the escapability from that situation. But in my study of history, to broaden this a little bit, one thing that I've learned almost always comes with newfound power is an obsessive desire to, at the very least, maintain it, if not, increase it. And we see in our own lives, whether we're talking about our parents or our teachers or the police or a judge, or even if we're lucky enough to interact with a politician, we see how threatened they become when their authority is questioned, when their power is challenged. If we look at the Western history of the parent-child relationship, and I'm guessing that the Eastern history of the parent-child relationship is no better, we see that parents seem to view children as some kind of advanced pet that will one day, if properly cared for and, of course, disciplined and controlled, grow into an actual human being. And although there are many different ways for those in power to deal with the perceived threat of those they exercise power over, parents, in my experience and understanding anyway, tend to take the most proactive approach. As soon as a child is able to speak and understand the language of the parents will begin inflicting a belief system onto that child, a belief system that was inflicted onto them that they have a great deal of comfort with, whether it be cultural, political, religious, or otherwise. What further exacerbates this power disparity are the frequent, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle suggestions that love, acceptance, sense of belonging for the child all seem to be tenuously dependent on their acceptance and embrace of the parent's values system and subsequent management system for that child. So here we see what is probably the most important, informative relationship for a very social animal, the human being, existing all too often as an exchange of perceived threats. The parent feels that power and control are always being threatened by the child, and this goes beyond just the curiosity of the child and the questioning of the belief or value system. And the child feels threatened, that things like love, belonging, acceptance might be withdrawn. And we can see how, from a very young age, a real fear for the consequences of disobedience, for the consequences of nonconformity is formed. This is why I believe that by the time somebody is 5 or 6 years old, many of the seeds that lead to what we see as the results of the Stanford Prison Experiment or the Milgram Experiment are already planted and growing. I think it's worth pointing out, too, that human relationships ideally should be voluntary, obviously, and there should be reciprocation. That's not our introduction. In our most formative years, that's not our introduction to important, what we call loving relationships. You know, that's not a voluntary. It's not that parents don't love their children. I'm not saying anything like that, but you know, we get used to very quickly, like I said, at a very formative time, to justifying a non-voluntary relationship with a tremendous imbalance of power. Why would we stop? For most people, I mean, that would mean acknowledging the involuntary nature of this first most important relationship. That's a very touchy subject for a lot of people. After a few years of this type of parent-child relationship, the child will head off to school, and that place, considering their experience at home, will make perfect sense. All through school, from elementary school right up through high school, we probably have memories of our experiences questioning or challenging authority. And if we think about those memories for just a minute, most of us, if not all of us, would agree that very rarely, in those instances where we challenged or questioned authority, was there any cooperative or constructive discourse about our objections. Let's talk about alternatives. What ideas do you have about how we can do things differently? I'm not saying that phrase was never uttered by anybody in positions of power or authority in primary or secondary school, but I wouldn't be surprised if you, the listener, never heard anything like that while you were in school. I know I never did. And if you did, you'd probably remember it, because at the time it was probably shocking, considering the fact that it's also very likely that you never had that kind of an interaction with your parents. Let's strategize on how we can do a better job of raising you. Let's do that together. Probably didn't happen. After 12 years of that, many of us head off to college, especially in the last few generations. And considering our experiences in high school, that place makes perfect sense. I've heard so many different stories about students questioning their professors on topics like history, psychology, philosophy, and economics, and being yelled at and ridiculed for their opinions or even just their questions. When we graduate from college, we become so-called citizens, and we begin interacting with the larger political world around us. That place, considering our experience, makes perfect sense. And when we look back on all of this experience, maybe we've even had some similar run-ins with the principal or even the police. Can you see the threat that you were to what was comfortable, to what was status quo? Can you see the concern and maybe even sometimes the panic that your individualism, that your curiosity generated for those who claim to have power over you? In the parent-child relationship, we can see the perception of threat, even though the child is just one tiny little human, a human that parent is supposed to love more than anybody else. In school, we can see the perception of threat in the teacher-student relationship, even though, at most, hopefully, the teacher is looking out at 30 or 40 faces, with the understanding that he or she is there to give those children valuable knowledge and instruction. In college, maybe it grows to a few hundred faces, but it's the same understanding, and those children have even worked harder to get to that position. In any interactions we might have had with judges or police, police have guns, and chances are you don't. They can use their gun and get away with it. You can't even fight back. Same thing with judges. The judge's gun is the power of the court. Contempt. In every one of those situations that I just described, we see extreme power disparity between the so-called authority and the subordinate or subordinates. But we still see this incredible fear of losing power, of losing control. So now, for a moment, imagine, if you will, a situation where it's not one little child or a room full of little children or even a room full of public school graduates who are supposed to be impressed with you because you wrote a book, or one traffic stop, or one defendant, but millions of people, some who might be armed, some who might be a lot smarter than you. And your authority, while incredibly rewarding for you personally, has no real meaning. No one is depending on you for survival. No one needs your guidance or your protection. And everyone has the ability to figure this out, that your power is totally imaginary. What would you do? All of these things considered, doesn't it seem a little naive to use the word conspiracy to counter a claim that time and thought, energy, resources, and money are poured into institutions and mechanisms designed to scientifically control and manage people? Not that I'm trying to generate any sympathy for anyone.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the show. This is Live Free FM. I'm your host. People call me Paranoid. You can catch us every single Saturday night right here on the Orion Talk Radio Network. Tonight, we are joined by our very special guest, Brett from the SchoolSucks podcast. And we've been talking about how school sucks, basically, and how it does not educate people to think and have critical thinking skills. And instead, it seems to pump out authoritarian, worshiping little zombies. And I've always thought that there was a reason for it. And from listening to Brett's podcast, I've come to the conclusion in that it is not just a coincidence that these are the types of children that are coming out of the school system. So, Brett, if you can, go ahead and start with, I guess maybe not the beginning, but start with wherever you want to start and tell us about how this mandatory school system came to be.
Sure. In the early 1800s, the 18 teens, the Kingdom of Prussia, the leadership, the intellectuals, the ruling class, they had a problem. And I think that I would describe it like this. Humans have these natural gifts: curiosity, the desire to remove contradiction and attain clarity, individuality, a sense of self, even like a propensity towards creative and exploratory, and sometimes somewhat capricious or unpredictable behavior. So, in other words, they are non-machine-like. And if you are trying to manage a society, if you are trying to manage an army, if you are trying to manage an emerging industrial economy, that sucks when you've got a bunch of people and they don't behave like machines. And when I talk about these natural gifts, this was the other reason why I named the show SchoolSucks, is because the curiosity, the individuality, the creativity, all very, very present when we're 5 or 6. And by the time we're 18, for too many people, it's in a very deep remission. It doesn't mean that it can't come back, but those are not things, those are not qualities that people are really embracing by and large anymore. I don't want to generalize completely, but I think it's a fair statement based on my observations, what I've seen from colleagues and friends and students and, all my experiences in and around education. So anyway, I think an interesting way to tell the story is there was a Prussian general. His name was Karl von Clausewitz. And this was the guy who coined the term, just so we have a little bit of information. He was a Prussian military leader in the mid-1800s. He was the one who coined the term total war.
And just for a background, Prussia is what eventually became Germany. Is that correct?
Yes. So the idea of total war was not new in von Clausewitz's time. Before that, it probably would have been referred to as something like the Fabian strategy, which goes back, to the Roman military leader Fabius Maximus, and when he was fighting the Carthaginians in North Africa. And this was basically the patient war, waiting out the enemy, a war of attrition. And then sometimes in the end, it would also include a finale like scorching the earth or salting the earth, burning everything and then putting salt in the farm. So it was like the idea that exists in the Fabian strategy is patience, but the idea that exists in total war that adds to the Fabian strategy is a permanent disarming of the enemy. And the reason why I'm going into this detail is because